This is my ranking of city building games like City Skylines that I've played based purely on my personal experience. Each one is placed from masterpiece down to trash depending on how deep the city management systems are, how smooth the planning and growth feel, and how well the game keeps long-term building engaging. Let's get straight into the list. Frostpunk was the kind of city builder that kept me stressed almost every minute, because every decision felt dangerous and permanent. I started with a few freezing survivors and slowly built a small city around the giant generator, but the harsh weather kept ruining my plans. Coal disappeared fast, food stayed low, and people became sick whenever I made a mistake. What stayed with me most were the laws, because I had to choose between protecting people or forcing them into terrible working conditions just to survive another cold night. I liked how the game never felt relaxing even after my city became larger, since new problems kept appearing without warning. The dark music and frozen world also matched the desperate atmosphere really well. This lands in the excellent tier. Transport Fever 2 turned me into someone constantly checking train lines, bus routes, and cargo deliveries because a single broken connection could slow everything down. I spent most of my time linking farms, factories, cities, and harbors while trying to keep every transport line making money. Seeing small towns expand after my vehicles finally started moving resources properly was the most satisfying part of the experience. I also liked watching the game move through different eras, since old steam trains slowly changed into modern high-speed machines later on. Some mechanics became frustrating because editing routes and fixing rail problems often took longer than expected, especially on larger maps with busy traffic everywhere. Even with those issues, building transportation networks still kept me playing for hours without noticing time passing. This settles into the good tier. Citystate II felt more like managing an entire country's problems than simply placing roads and buildings across a map. I spent most of my time changing taxes, policies, immigration rules, and public spending while different parts of the city reacted slowly over time. Instead of focusing mainly on decoration, the game pushed me to understand unemployment, poverty, education, and wealth distribution across different neighborhoods. I liked experimenting with systems and seeing how small economic changes could slowly transform the city after several in-game years passed. The deeper mechanics also made the experience harder to understand because some menus and systems were not explained clearly enough, especially during larger cities with many moving parts. Even with those frustrations, I still respected how ambitious and different the game felt compared to sandbox builders. This sits in the good tier. Urbek City Builder felt much calmer and easier to understand than most large-scale city simulators I usually spend time with. I began with basic farms, logging mills, and small roads, then slowly expanded everything into larger neighborhoods filled with services and busy streets. I liked how the game connected every part of the city together, because housing, food production, and public needs all depended on proper planning. The voxel graphics also looked really nice, especially during the night cycle when the entire city became full of lights and movement. Another feature I enjoyed was walking through the streets in first-person mode because it made the city feel more alive after hours of building. I did wish the game offered clearer objectives after the tutorial ended, but the relaxing system still made it worth playing. This belongs in the great tier. Banished immediately made me pay attention to food, firewood, and survival because even a small mistake during winter could destroy an entire settlement. I began with a few families in the wilderness and slowly built farms, homes, forests, and workplaces while trying to keep everybody alive through changing seasons. What I liked most was how natural the difficulty felt since problems usually happened because of poor planning instead of unfair mechanics. Expanding too quickly often created food shortages, but growing too slowly caused the population to shrink over time. I also enjoyed how clean the interface looked because most of the screen stayed focused on the town itself rather than endless menus. The lack of goals did reduce my motivation after building a stable village, but surviving winters felt rewarding enough. This enters the good tier. Songs of Six made me feel like I was controlling an entire kingdom instead of a small colony because the scale became enormous very quickly. I started with a few citizens and slowly expanded into a massive city filled with farms, armies, workshops, markets, and crowded streets packed with workers. Every race had different needs, which forced me to carefully balance food, housing, religion, sanitation, and public order at the same time. I also liked how disasters could appear naturally whenever resources became low or loyalty started dropping across the population. Watching thousands of citizens move around the city carrying goods and constructing buildings always looked satisfying after many hours of planning. The learning curve was difficult at first, but understanding the deeper systems became extremely rewarding later on. This belongs in the masterpiece tier. Farthest Frontier kept me constantly changing priorities because one bad season, animal attack, or food shortage could destroy months of progress. I began with a tiny settlement in the wilderness and slowly expanded it into a busy medieval town filled with farms, workshops, markets, and defensive walls. The survival systems were my favorite part since every resource mattered, especially during winter when people started freezing or starving after small mistakes. I also enjoyed how production chains became more complicated over time because creating simple items often required several connected industries working together properly. Bandit raids and dangerous wildlife added extra pressure whenever my town finally started becoming successful and wealthy. Even though the early pacing sometimes felt slow, watching the settlement grow into a functioning city stayed satisfying for many hours. This earns the great tier spot. Town to City felt much calmer than most city builders I usually play because it focused heavily on creativity and decoration instead of disasters. I began with a tiny settlement containing only a few roads and houses, then slowly expanded everything into a colorful town filled with parks, shops, markets, and busy streets. My favorite part was placing almost every object manually since even small decorations like flowers, benches, and trees completely changed how the town looked afterward. The voxel visuals also looked beautiful during sunsets when lights started glowing across the city at night. I liked how new buildings and customization options unlocked steadily because there was always something new to add after reaching larger population milestones. The relaxed pacing sometimes reduced the challenge, but building towns stayed satisfying for hours. This reaches the great tier. Foundation reminded me of guiding a living medieval settlement rather than directly controlling every building across the map. I painted housing zones, placed important structures, and then watched villagers slowly create roads and neighborhoods on their own. The gridless construction system made every town feel different because churches, farms, markets, and houses could fit naturally into the landscape instead of snapping into strict squares. I also enjoyed the slower and peaceful pacing, since mistakes were easier to recover from compared to harsher survival builders. Managing trade and production still needed attention whenever tools or resources became difficult to obtain during larger expansions. Some economic systems were harder to understand because tracking production chains was not always clear enough. Even with those issues, the relaxing atmosphere kept me building for sessions. This settles into the good tier. Nova Roma pushed me into thinking about rivers, terrain, and engineering far more than most city builders I usually play. I began with small farms, houses, and dirt roads, then slowly expanded everything into a large Roman settlement connected through aqueducts, reservoirs, and production districts. The water systems became my favorite feature because flooding could destroy entire neighborhoods whenever I ignored proper planning for too long. I also enjoyed balancing religion and citizen happiness since different gods offered bonuses while punishing neglected cities harshly. Watching tiny villages grow into organized urban centers filled with markets, entertainers, and specialized workers stayed satisfying after many hours of planning and rebuilding. Some mechanics still felt rough because of the early access state, but the ambition and scale kept me fully invested throughout. This belongs in the excellent tier easily. Workers and Resources Soviet Republic pushed me into managing every tiny part of a functioning industrial nation instead of casually placing buildings across a map. I spent hours organizing trains, buses, sewage systems, power lines, factories, and delivery routes, while trying to keep the entire republic operating smoothly. Even simple construction projects required planning because roads, demolitions, and public services all depended on proper vehicles, workers, and materials arriving at correct locations. I liked how every system connected together, since one transportation failure or power shortage could slowly damage the economy across multiple cities. The realistic logistics systems were difficult during my first attempts, but watching huge industrial districts finally work efficiently felt rewarding afterward. Very few management games offered this much depth and control during long play sessions. This belongs in the excellent tier. Timberborn slowly turned into one of the smartest survival city builders I played because water management affected nearly every part of my settlement. I started with a few beavers gathering logs, farming crops, and pumping water, then expanded into large towns powered by windmills, dams, and complicated production systems. The changing rivers became my favorite mechanic since droughts could destroy farms and leave entire districts without enough drinking water for survival. I also enjoyed experimenting with irrigation systems and reservoirs because preparing for dry seasons always felt rewarding later. Bad water floods added extra pressure whenever poisonous water spread across the land and damaged crops around my settlement. Even though the early progression sometimes felt slower than expected, building efficient colonies remained satisfying for many hours afterward. This belongs in the masterpiece tier without becoming repetitive either. Ostriv made simple village expansion feel surprisingly realistic because every citizen had needs that constantly required attention from me. I started with small farms, wooden homes, and rough dirt roads, then slowly expanded everything into a larger Ukrainian settlement filled with markets, fisheries, and livestock farms. I liked how families needed proper food, housing, water, and money because people would eventually leave whenever daily life became too difficult. The free placement system also helped towns look natural, since roads and walking paths formed around where villagers traveled most often. Farming became deeper than expected because soil quality changed over time and crop rotation mattered for keeping harvests stable later. Some economic systems were difficult during my first hours, but the detailed atmosphere and slower pacing kept me interested constantly. This earns the great tier spot. Surviving Mars Relaunched placed me on a hostile planet where every mistake could slowly destroy an entire colony without warning. I began with small drones and basic resource stations, then expanded everything into larger domes filled with workers and research buildings. I liked the atmosphere and soundtrack because the empty red landscape created a lonely feeling during long play sessions. Natural disasters like dust storms, meteor showers, and freezing temperatures also added pressure whenever my colony finally became stable enough to grow further. The biggest issue was that progression eventually felt repetitive, since many missions and challenge modes played very similarly after several hours. I also expected more meaningful upgrades from the relaunch version because most additions felt surprisingly small compared to the original release after spending much more time. This settles into the mediocre tier. Manor Lords captured my attention through its realistic medieval atmosphere and natural village growth across open countryside. I started with a tiny group of settlers living inside tents, then slowly expanded the settlement into a larger town filled with farms, markets, workshops, and winding dirt roads. The building system became my favorite feature because roads curved naturally around forests and hills, while every structure changed the village layout in meaningful ways. I also enjoyed managing seasonal jobs since farming, gathering food, and preparing firewood all mattered during different parts of the year. The atmosphere stayed impressive throughout my playtime thanks to detailed landscapes, changing weather, and peaceful music playing softly in the background. Even though the early access content still feels limited sometimes, the foundation already feels extremely promising. This belongs in the excellent tier easily. That's my ranking of the city building games I've played. Watching tiny settlements grow into massive cities was the best part of many of these, even if a few eventually lost momentum once the challenge started fading away. Thanks for watching.